So now that brings us to page 2, where you had a slide that asked whether the lungs were muscular structures, and I hope your answer was no here. The material properties of the lungs are such that they're stretchable material. And the lungs also have elastic recoil. So we want to keep that in mind. They can stretch, right? And then they can undergo this elastic recoil. And the stretching is important for inhalation. And of course, the elastic recoil is important for exhalation. And I noted here, even though it's hard to see, the muscles associated with the chest wall. Those are what allow for the actual expansion during inhalation, which now brings us to the actual mechanics for ventilation for both normal and forced inhalation, exhalation, right? I wanted you to note what kind of muscles contract or relax, whether it is an active process, meaning that requires work be done, actual contraction rather than relaxation of muscles, or is it relaxation, a passive process, for instance. What I note here is that normal inspiration, when you expand your lungs, well, that's an active process. You have muscle contraction occurring. Your diaphragm, for instance, is contracting, and that muscle now moves inferiorly, moves down, expanding that space, right? And we can say increasing the volume. External intercostals would be the other muscles, the ones associated with the ribs. They're now contracting as well, and they're moving out and up, also helping to expand the volume, right, of the lungs. That's normal inspiration or inhalation. Then we have forced inspiration or inhalation. Here, you're taking that normal inhalation process and you're adding accessory muscles, right? So I just noted that it's even more work now to have this forced inspiration. So the diaphragm contraction, the external intercostals, and now our accessory muscles are the ones I have listed here. I don't need you to memorize those, although it's likely you know them from anatomy. Just keep in mind that it will be more work and more muscles are involved in that action of forced inhalation or inspiration. Then for normal expiration, this is a passive process where now the diaphragm relaxes, right, and the external intercostals relax. So we have no contraction occurring to allow for air to be expelled from the lungs. So simply allowing for the elastic recoil of the lungs to take over. And what happens is the chest wall has to follow the lungs. Okay? And I noted that here, the lungs recoil, right? When these muscles now relax, the muscles associated with respiration, and the chest wall follows along and helps push air out, right? We're decreasing the volume, we're increasing the pressure within the intra-alveolar space, and now our pressure gradient has reversed so that higher pressure inside, then outside, and air now moves out. However, forced expiration, that's an active process because not only do you relax the normal muscles associated with expiration, but you actually contract some extra muscles. Internal intercostals and abdominal muscles are now being used in order to push even further, decrease that volume even further, create a larger intra-alveolar pressure and a greater pressure gradient to force more air out. Right? But we still have generally the lung recoil occurring with the relaxation of the normal muscles of respiration. And the chest wall, we say, is being compliant and it's following along. Right. Now for inspiration, we have the opposite in terms of who's being compliant and who's following along. For inspiration, whether it's normal or forced, the chest wall is doing the expanding, right? The active expansion, and the lungs are being compliant and stretching along with the chest wall. And this is opening up the volume of the lungs, the intra-alveolar space, dropping the pressure below atmospheric pressure, such that now we have a pressure gradient that allows for air to flow in. Right? We think of this almost as pulling air into the lungs upon inhalation and then pushing air out upon exhalation. Now the next question, question 6, expands on these points I made about the lungs of the chest wall being compliant and following along. Right? Why do the lungs move the chest wall? Why does the chest wall move the lungs? Depending on whether we're talking about inspiration or expiration here. And that's because we have suction between the outer wall of the lungs and the inner surface of the chest wall. Right? So this suction between the outer surface of the lungs, the inner surface of the chest wall is very important for these mechanics to work appropriately. And I asked you to take these terms here and draw a diagram like the one that you saw on the slide of a cross section through the lungs to show these different surfaces and fluids that are involved. So here I have the lung surrounded by what's called the visceral pleura, which is a type of serosal membrane. This membrane is made out of simple squamous epithelial tissue. And it's hard to see, but it says this epithelial tissue secretes a serum-like fluid. And that serum-like fluid is what's building up and being maintained in this cavity that I'm showing here in blue. What's referred to as the serosal, but more often the pleural fluid within the pleural cavity. So we have a fluid-filled space. Right? And then we have another serosal membrane that lines the inner wall of the chest wall. That would be the visceral pleura. It's also contributing to this, this production of this serum-like fluid. And we know that the serum itself is mainly water. And so what we have going on here are dynamics by which water molecules are being cohesive with one another due to their attractive forces, their ability to form hydrogen bonds. Not only forming hydrogen bonds with one another, but forming hydrogen bonds with other polar materials surrounding them. In that pleural fluid or associated with those epithelial cells. And we say this then forms a vacuum seal between the outer wall of the lung and the inner wall of the chest cavity. It's meant to ensure that there's no frictional rubbing between the lung and the chest wall. It's one of its functions. But another very important function is this cohesiveness that occurs. Right? Like I said, I think of it as suction that occurs because this vacuum seal. And that allows then the lungs to move when the chest wall moves actively, and the lung will follow passively upon expansion. And then when the chest wall, right, those muscles associated with the diaphragm and the external intercostals, those relax, then we get the elastic properties of the lungs taking over. They recoil and they bring the chest wall with them. There we go, with them, because you have two lungs. At least most of us do. So I asked, is there water in the pleural cavity? Yes, it's serum derived. It is vital to this this vacuum that's being formed. Is there air in the pleural cavity? No, there should not be air in that space. Actually, we see later on that if we do get air in that space, then we break that seal and we can get either a complete or partial lung collapse. It's called atelectasis. So then I wanted you to think about the dynamics of the recoil, make sure that you had that down in terms of the direction of movement, right? First, by defining what recoil means, the tendency to snap back to a resting position. This is true of any type of material that has elastic properties. It can be stretched, and then it has the tendency to snap back to its original shape and position. That's true of the lungs. Right? It's also true of the chest wall. The chest wall itself has elastin interspersed within the muscular structures, or you can just say elastic tissue too. And I think I noted that up here. The chest wall has elastic tissue too. So that means not only do the lungs have a tendency to recoil, but the chest wall as well. The lungs have a tendency to recoil inward, but the chest wall has a tendency to recoil outward. Right? If we actually dissociated the lungs and the chest wall from one another, if we broke this vacuum seal, then the lung would undergo that collapse, that atelectasis, right? And collapse inward, recoil inward, while the chest wall would move in the opposite direction, right? Even without active contraction of muscle, just the elastic recoil due to the elastic tissue that's present will cause the chest wall to recoil out. And this can lead to what's referred to as barrel chest for an individual that has a collapsed lung. You see the chest wall recoiling out as the lung has collapsed in once we break that suction, that vacuum seal. Okay. So the dynamics are such that when you breathe in, the chest wall recoils out. Breathe in, chest wall recoils out, but I noted here, but you also have the active muscle contraction as well. Right? That's the main effect, is active contraction of the diaphragm, of the external intercostal muscles, but you have the elastic properties that aid that too, to allow for the chest wall to move out, and the lungs are going to stretch. They're compliant with that movement. Then as you breathe out, right, and you relax those muscles, then the stretchable lungs now take over and they have their recoil in, and the chest wall will be compliant and actually stretch, right, in order to follow the lungs.